Okay, so we had this idea just to kind of sit down and ask you questions. We feel like as a staff, we get to sit in a room with you in a much more intimate setting
Right.
and hear you pour out your heart. And sometimes trying to get that out to the average person who just comes on Sunday morning to TFH maybe doesn't know the history of 35 years of ministry. And
Right.
so we just wanted to find a way to put that in a way that we could give it away to the people that call this place their home,
Right.
that they understood the DNA, the shibboleth, if you will, of who we are. So let's just start with that word right there. You threw out the word shibboleth several years ago, and it
Yeah.
really resonated in our hearts. So talk us through that word.
Well, there's an Old Testament story, right, about how the enemy's coming against the people of God, and they couldn't tell who the enemy was, quite honestly. And so the word shibboleth, the accent, and so that essence of who we are comes through our language, right? So you hear someone use a word, they have an accent, and you recognize what region they're from or how they've been raised, what part of the territory. And so the way they could distinguish who was friendly and who wasn't was they could recognize the shibboleth, they could recognize the accent or the content, the context, who they come through. So everybody has a shibboleth. Every family has a shibboleth. I think one of the best stories I can talk about is how when you first got married and you came roaring into the house on about 3 o'clock on a Christmas afternoon, and it was the first Christmas you'd spent with Sean's family. And you came in and you were just going, oh, they did this, and they ate this, and they did this. And it was different. And what we all realized was, well, Sean's family has a shibboleth. They eat certain foods, they say certain things, and so do ours. So there's a shibboleth to every family, to every tribe, to every region of the world for that matter. So every church has a shibboleth. You can recognize the way they're living together, what's important to them, their values, their vision. And though we're all part of the church, the Christian church, each local fellowship has their own accent, their own flavor. And so what is the way of the Father's house? What are our unique callings and unique things that set us apart? That's shibboleth. And so what I've been trying to do for years is let's recognize the shibboleth of this community, the shibboleth of our larger community, the communion, and share that and let you be shaped by that. So that if you live with this family, these are the ways that we share our love. These are the ways that we are formed and shaped and become more and more and more like the God that we see. And so everybody has that shibboleth. And so the shibboleth of the Father's house, the shibboleth of the communion. And can we recognize it? Do we understand it? And so when people come into the family, they come into this is the way we live. This is the rhythm by which we live. And that's what it means to be, to have a shibboleth that you can recognize. And all your children, all my grandchildren, they're being raised in a shibboleth. They're being raised in a way, and through that shibboleth, they're going to look at the world and say, that's good, that's healthy, that's God. And they're going to do it unconsciously because we're all being conditioned and formed, shaped by the world in which we live, by the church we go to, by our experiences. And sometimes we allow that to happen without thought. And so we allow ourselves to be shaped and we don't even know it. And so to have some intentionality, that's shibboleth.
Well, and don't you find, or maybe what resonated with that word is it's better language to communicate the flavors
Yes.
of Christianity. I think sometimes our language limits people from being a part
Yes.
of. And so I think there's a lot of unification just in that word and understanding that just because another church down the street, for a lack of a better word, celebrates Thanksgiving dinner with different food on their table than the way we might, doesn't make them less Christian or more Christian.
Correct.
But I think something about that shibboleth really gives a better, broader understanding of sort of part of who the communion is that unity.
Yes,
So
yeah.
the verse that we use as the community is John 17, right? Go ahead and quote that.
Well, that we'd all be one.
as Christ and
as God in us, the Father in us, and us in Him. And I think, boy, that's a great point, is that the larger shibboleth, that we are part of the one holy Catholic Church, that we're part of that bigger thing, right? And the denominations always point out, labels always point out what makes us different. Or if you're looking for shibboleth, you're trying to find, well, what makes us, what makes it one? And that doesn't mean that each tribe doesn't have their own unique. So if we look at the Old Testament, it was Abraham's descendants, but there were 12 tribes. And they all had the big things in common, right? But then they had their own uniqueness. And so the shibboleth of the worldwide church, we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that He died on a cross, that He rose. So those things that we all hold in common. And yet there is a shibboleth to these different flavors, of the church. But we're not against one another. We recognize the value of different expressions, but we also recognize that we're all part of the same family of God. And so it's all right to have certain focuses and shibboleths that's unique to the Father's house, and there's uniqueness to another church across town, because we're all one. But that doesn't mean my way is better than, doesn't mean that way is wrong. It simply means that it's probably distinctive to being a Moore, or distinctive to being a Smith, or distinctive to be. So to recognize my distinctives without saying I'm right and you're wrong. We're living in a world that's binary, meaning that if I have this perspective, you don't have that perspective, you're wrong.
Polarizing,
divisive. So shibboleth should not be divisive. It just should be identifying. How do I identify the family I belong to, the family I worship with? So it's identifying, but it's not divisive.
So two of the words you use a lot of times are the essentials of our faith and the non-essentials of our faith. Talk through that, and talk through what would you describe as being essential, or those things that maybe are non-essential.
It's a great question. It's a question that lots of Christians never consider. So essential means what I must understand, or what I must see. So Jesus is the Son of God, and I repent and believe in Him. That's an essential to the faith, right? I have to recognize, whoever believes in me shall not perish. That's an essential. But bene esse. So the difference between esse and bene esse. Esse is essential. Bene means it's good for you. Every different flavor, to use your word, denomination, whatever, there are essentials that lock us together. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the believing that Christ was the substitute for our sins. That's essential. Bene essential. Some people speak in tongues, some people don't speak in tongues. Tongues may be beneficial, but they may not be essential to my salvation. Whether I take communion with wine or with grape juice. That may be beneficial, but it's not essential. So there's a lot of people that focus on what they think is beneficial, and it probably is. But it doesn't mean that it's essential to my salvific relationship with God. And most of the time, what separates us are these arguments about these second level beneficial things. I don't think that you don't have to make the right gestures, or listen, there's no wrong way to pray, in my opinion. God isn't saying, well, if you'd have asked it like this, if you'd said it like that, then prayer's communication. But a lot of people focus on those beneficial things, which are good, but they're not essential to my faith. So what's essential? Well, the Father so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in Him and confess Him would have everlasting. That's kind of a non-negotiable, really.
So when we use creeds
a
lot.
Right.
And the Apostles' Creed is the one that, at least from formation in children's church and youth, we really try and pass the Apostles' Creed to kids. Right. Our goal is to make sure they can recite it. And would you say that the Apostle Creed holds within it the essentials of faith, that if I meet another Christian from a different flavor, a different tribe, a different tongue, that if they believe the Apostles' Creed, the baselines of, that those would be a good way to describe the essentials of faith?
It took me a long time to cull through the tribes that I grew up in. We were always trying to write out what we believe. We always had these statements of faith that we handed out to people, and they were not bad. But as I continually grew in the faith, what I began to realize is the oldest statement of our faith, the baptismal statement from the very early church, from first century, second century, third century church. If we take it back to the beginning, so to speak, there were several iterations of the rule of faith, what you confessed when you were being baptized. And that today, in every historic expression, is referred to as the Apostles' Creed. And it's a statement of, I believe in God the Father Almighty. I believe in Jesus Christ. It is the very simplest form of trying to encapsulate what the essentials of our faith are. So what has always been believed everywhere by everyone, it is the creed. And so it's a summarization, it's an overview. I think it's the easiest place and the most stable place to go back and say to people that are coming to faith, to raise our children in, here's just a nice summary. And it is very, very historic. You can't change it. So it's a statement of, I believe. And that creed is a baptismal creed. The second most widely used creed is the Nicene Creed. And it is, we believe. So it then takes our individual statement and puts it in the community that we together. I think one of the things that has to happen in the 21st century is this common understanding of what the foundation of the faith is. And that's our unifying shibboleth, so to speak. And so I hold that up because as an evangelical, as a Pentecostal who longs to see the whole church unified, the creed's one of those things that I can go to and go, now look, this has always been believed from the beginning by everyone, everywhere. And so I think it's a unifying statement. As you know, the Father's house has come to rest on that as being, this is just the central way we can say,
this is what I believe.
This is what I believe. Yeah.
I think as someone who was raised specifically in this church for 35 years, I heard the Apostles' Creed, but it was not a part of the spiritual formation process when I went through children's church and youth ministry. And so I can remember sitting as a young person and people asking, what do you believe? And I would try and pull those scriptures to memory and pull those. I knew I believed, I just didn't know how to put it into words. And, I just think language sometimes can be such a benefit when you can hand a child language and now they can state, this is a ball, this is a dog. And so to hand Christians language in the faith that says, I believe in God the Father Almighty. He's greater than, above, created, not made. He was before the beginning. The fact that it encompasses the virgin birth. Hampton, who's a junior higher, is going through health class, and for the first time he was going, this is why we call the virgin birth. And I said, yes, because it's a linchpin to
God.
our faith. If she was not a virgin when she, then that would not be a linchpin to our faith. And the resurrection, all of those pieces, the Trinitarian effect. I mean, we believe the Trinity as being an essential to our faith. That's in the Apostles' Creed. And I think sometimes, though we're giving it to children to memorize, our hope is that as they continue to form into adulthood, that they see the beauty of the language in there.
That's exactly right, because the creed gets bigger as you grow.
Exactly.
So you hand it to a child 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. They may not grasp all of the nuances of the creed because of their own maturity level. But as we mature in the faith,
just as Paul says,
we grow, And so the creed is received in its essence, and then it grows in its energy. And that's interesting that at 12, Hampton now, well, at 64 almost, it's still doing that. It's still going. So it's not that I know everything, it's that the creed and other things like it continue to open doors, and God gets bigger and larger. It doesn't it feels like at first when you say the creed, you've reduced the faith, when in fact, if you take the faith back to its simplest form, it continues to enlarge and get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's why it's so important to have a baseline to begin and then let it run through life. And that's a great
I think
story.
you just made an interesting point that I think in the Pentecostal charismatic flavor at times, we will feel limited by things that are handed to us to read, versus allowing it to become limitless inside of us. And so I think sometimes because the DNA of who we are, some of the bedrock, it was formed in the Pentecostal charismatic movement. Sometimes when we were handed written prayers, I can remember when the church first went through the change into some more liturgy and things like that, it felt very limiting to people. So talk about how being handed something that was written beyond me is limiting, and yet reading scriptures would not be limiting. I mean, it's the same thing being handed to me. One's limiting and one's not. So talk through why is that a false perception?
Well, you made the statement a while ago that without language, I can't communicate. So language is the only way I can communicate thoughts. So without words, there's no creation. Without words, there's no... So until we can define, until we can simply put some words to what we believe, then it can't expand. And so again, using the creed, you put it in its simplest form, then you've opened the door for a bigger discussion. But if you can't agree on this, then how can you expand your knowledge? So for me, raised in an evangelical Pentecostal world where prayer was at its finest when it was spontaneous and it was above my thought, right? That's wonderful. I still pray in tongues. It's still very But how do I find the center of that? Well, let's go back to scriptures. The Christ told us to pray this way. Well, in other words, it's a place of beginning. It's a place of centering. It's a place of. And if we can keep coming back to that Our Father, then it keeps enlarging itself. And so from the earliest of times, the early fathers, the apostles, they began to write prayers down. Well, I write prayers down, you write prayers down, and we pray them again. Well, if they're really good prayers, and if they were good then, they're good now. So every morning I read several prayers that are very old, and every time I read them, I go, oh, that's still good today. So it's the embracing of the ancient and the embracing of the prophetic. It's what the scriptures say, bringing out the old and the new, and recognize I'm connected to that which is very ancient, and yet through the gifts of the Spirit I'm connected to that that's very future. And I live in the tension of those two worlds. Neither one are constricting. Both of them are shaping. And I'm being shaped and mentored by people long gone. And yet I'm being pulled into this image of the future. You got to expand your horizons, open your perspective, and see it from other. And sometimes when I'm reading prayers of other people, I went, oh, I never saw it like that. And so it enlarges me. It's the wisdom of the ancients, right? And I think the other thing it does, honey, is it kind of protects us from a culture that thinks anything goes. This culture that doesn't seem to have any boundaries, that everybody doing right in their own eyes. When I allow my faith to be anchored in the ancient, anchored in the early fathers, now I don't get caught off track by all these other pluralistic expressions of a God that I know is not God. So how am I anchored in that wisdom? Well, written prayers, some of the oldest prayer books ever designed to pray those in a refreshing way. I don't think any of it has restricted me. I think, in fact, it's enlarged my life, made my faith bigger than it's ever been. Isn't it interesting? Nobody wants to submit. Nobody wants to give their life to a rhythm of prayer and not let it just come off the top of my head. So
we've talked about multiple things here, but I think they speak to the shibboleth of who the communion is as a whole, and who we are as the Father's house, and were before we were part of the communion. I think it's part of what drew us to the communion and the essence of why the communion began, which is this shibboleth of we believe that there are essential things to our faith and beneficial essentials to our faith, but that these can unify us with others. So unity is a essential part of who our shibboleth is. Understanding our faith and being spiritually formed is essential to the Father's house. It would be a part of our shibboleth that we are intentional about doing that from early stage through adulthood. And hold on a second, because now I've lost my train of thought. Something I heard you say that I think is also a piece that maybe we don't think of very quickly when we talk about our shibboleth is that sacred middle ground. I think sometimes people hear us talk about utilizing written prayers and allowing the spontaneous, and in a current very polarizing culture, they want you to take a stand on one side or the other.
Right.
And I think there's something very sacred about standing in those tensions. And you talk about that a lot in Advent, about how it's the first coming, and yet we're also in the waiting period. And so talk about that tension, and how one of the beauties I think about the Father's house is we do kind of stand in this sacred middle ground that calls people. There was some language you used about celebrating the ancient, calling forth the present, or calling forth the future, but being present in this moment as well. And I think that's been lost in a lot of flavors, specifically in our culture as a whole, when they're trying to get you to make a decision and stand firm on one side or the other on what we might think are.
Well, how do we, the best story I can remember, and you'll remember this, Avery, my granddaughter, I was pushing her on a swing, and I was trying to get her to lean back and then to kick forward, right? And pretty soon Avery said, "Papa, if I lean way back and I kick really high, kick really forward, I go really high." One of the things that as we try to navigate the 21st century with all of the questions that we have with the emergence of science and technology and the internet and all that, how do we navigate today and be the holy people God's called us to be? Well, if you can celebrate the ancient, and if you can reach for the future. So for me, that's the foundation of the church and the prophetic eschatology of the church. Think of Christ hanging on a cross, reaching to the old and yet reaching to the prophetic, and living in the tension of both. So how do I live in the present moment? How do I live in this challenge of the 21st century? Well, I have to be anchored or rooted in the truth. If you're rooted, then you can reach real forward to what is yet to be, and I can call into existence those things that are not, and they let me anchor here. Many times people want to lean way, way back in and think that the history of the church is everything. Well, it may need to have a prophetic impulse of today. It may need to have the relationship of the Holy Spirit today. So many people lean so far out here that they become so heavenly minded that they're not rooted to where we started. So I think the way we live in the present moment is to be in between, just as Christ was between heaven and between earth, and he was that intercessor of those two colliding worlds. So as I grew in my own pastorate, needing to be connected to the whole, understanding that who we are is not the totality of everything, and that our opinions, our views of the world did not encompass everything. So how could I participate in the whole church, past, present, and future, America and European, Protestant and Catholic and evangelical? How does that all come together? Well, that requires me knowing the history. That requires me understanding the journey that has brought us to this point. And it also, how do I relate in relationship to the Holy Spirit that continually leads me forward into the realities of God? You have to celebrate the ancient, and you have to call forth the future, and you have to hold it in the tension of this moment. And that's the Reformation. And we're living in a world that wants to deconstruct everything, and there's a huge difference between reforming and deconstructing, or being stuck. Even as I say that, you could be stuck. And there's still more to hear from God. But it must be in unity with what's been going on. So how do I do that? I think that's still what gets me up every day. What gets me up every day is to teach people to live in daily fellowship with the unconditional love of the Father. Teaching people to live in that embrace of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Calling people to love like Christ. So many times we can quote the old and be so unkind with it that it never makes any sense. Or we can call people to such a utopia that it's not anchored in the reality of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So how do we draw people into living in the presence of God today? And that's rooted in our truths, and yet reaching into that great mystery of what we don't know. That's faith. I mean, that is faith, right? I can't conquer the mystery. I have to celebrate the mystery. But that doesn't mean I don't know anything. I mean, we've been given these mysteries to steward them. So it doesn't mean we don't know, but it means we don't know what we don't know. But there are things we do know. And so we don't move off of those. So I think the Father's house has been uniquely positioned to bridge between old and new, to bridge between what some would refer to as Protestant and Catholic, evangelical and Pentecostal, all those labels. We're one church. How do we recognize the grace, the truth, the mercy in each other? I'm just reading a book by Rowan Williams, and he said, could we stop seeing each other as objects? Something to be accessed that helps me? Could we quit seeing each other as something to be measured by how we live and perform and our value and whether we're right or wrong? And could we merely see each other as the image of God, and that perform, don't perform, good, bad, whatever, that we first and foremost have to love every human being as the image of God? That's hard for us to do because we've been handed such a model that we have to measure everybody rather than just loving each other because we exist, because we are. So how do we teach people to live in daily fellowship with the unconditional love of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? And I don't think we have all the answers, but I do think that's a great journey. And I think that's what keeps the Father house centered, is we're going to love God, we're going to love each other, and we're going to love the world. And I'm not sure we have all the answers, but our focus is to be loved and to love others, and to be anchored in what we know to be the great traditions of the church, and yet be open to receive the prophetic leading of the church. The church has grown. The church has, when I started pastoring, if you were divorced, you couldn't. When I started pastoring, if you're a woman, you couldn't. There's a lot of things that we're growing into, and that scares people because they can't put it in a box. So that the ancient truths don't put us in a box. The creed doesn't put us in a box. It actually just gives us a launching pad out into, and yet we can't jettison that, right? We have to stay anchored in both. And I think the real mystery of our faith is scary to people who just want black and white answers. And I don't know that we have black and white answers for anybody. And even if as I say that sounds bad. But to live in this mystery of the old and the new, to live in this mystery of the presence of God.
Two things you said that are going to make me take a left turn that I don't know if we'll use this for
We
the church or
can
not, but
edit
I'm going
this and
to
do
left turn
whatever
it.
we want to do with it.
Because I think they're two good thoughts to just to walk through. The first one being this concept of deconstruction that is sort of running rampant, really because the church globally, since its beginning, has she's gotten it wrong at times. And at time, there's many people that have stories where they've been hurt by the church that puts them on this path that I think as humans, then we start tearing that. In some ways, we're sort of tearing it apart. And I think the heart of a deconstructionist is to try and understand what were those limiting beliefs that I had. You asked a question 2 Sundays ago. What are the limiting beliefs in my life that are holding me back from? And so I think if we could reframe this deconstructionist thought process to the way you define the word apocalyptic, and what is limiting me? What do I need God to unveil in my life that maybe the faith that was handed to me by my parents or grandparents was limited on the knowledge they had at the time. And instead of, I can respect my great-grandmother's limited ability as a Cherokee Indian in the 1950s and 60s to understand who God is that we see today in the 21st century. So maybe talk through, instead of a deconstructionist thought process, maybe reframe that word from an idea of
well, deconstructionist is the only way we have to remodel, right? So DIY, let me use a metaphor here. So you walk into an old house and you strip it of all the stuff that is crumbling and you rebuild it. So there's that whole mentality. Right? That's an entire mentality that has gripped the Western world, right? So when we talk about deconstructing, we really see it from this idea of tearing down and building up. And so I think you have to kind of get that in everybody's mind. When the reality of it is that the church is not an institution. We think it is, but it's not. The church is the body of Christ. The church are the people that live in the presence of God and are sharing these essentials of faith, right? So it's not a denomination or association, though we would like to think that it is. And though most of us interact with the church that is institutional or that has a government and it has its rules and its regulations. And so, unfortunately, we reduce the church down to that, whether it's Baptist, Episcopalian, Lutheran, we reduce, well, that's not the church. The church is a living, breathing organism that transcends, if you will, all those institutional aspects. And so what's happening today is people are looking at the institutional church and realizing how it's failed. Well, anything that has human constructs falls short, right?
Well, and the Bible's full of them.
Yeah.
David. I mean, every character in the Bible that we set up as
they're human.
Were human failures.
They're human. So when we look at the church and we say we're going to reconstruct her, deconstruct her, we have to recognize we're generally talking about human constructs. So for me as a churchman, wait a minute, I'm talking about this living, breathing organism that cannot be defined by any institution. That's why we believe in unity, is that Pope Francis and I, institutionally, will never be one. I mean, the institutionalized church of the Roman Catholics or of the communion, they'll never be one. But he and I are one. He and I are one because, in his words, the music is the same. We know we agree on the essentials of the faith. We know that the essentials of the faith are evolving, and we're trying to understand that. So I don't like the word deconstructionist because it means to tear down. I like Martin Luther. Martin Luther comes on the scene and confronts what he sees as being challenges of the 15th century. And he starts trying to reform her, get her to change, get her to grow, get her to see beyond those limiting beliefs that she's had. He never envisioned there being a Lutheran church. He envisioned the people of God growing and altering and becoming more like Christ. So my caution to us is that we live in the spirit of Martin Luther, and we live in that spirit that we're ever growing and ever trying to understand these essentials and how they apply to today. That's not scary to me. But neither does that mean I know I have an answer today. That means I have to walk this out. So I think when we talk about the church deconstructing or reforming, we generally are thinking institutionally. I'm a pastor, 35 years. Every situation must be taken within the context of the people whose lives you're living with. There has to be a pastoral aspect to it. There's not a one-size-fits-all. You're not going to get the church to agree to this or to that. You're going to have to recognize that pastorally we are called to engage with the woman thrown in the dust. We're called to engage with Zacchaeus and the tree. We're called to engage on the Sabbath with the man with the withered hand, which it appears that Christ is breaking the traditions of the faith when in fact He's enlarging the faith. But that's a process we have to live day by day. There's not going to be a line where everybody understands it. So I think in the history of the church, the people living in the presence of God, the ongoing history is that we're ever moving, we're ever growing, and some of us are going to grow at some rates, and some of us are going to grow at other rates. And we have to allow what Paul says, if you have the faith to eat the meat, eat the meat. If you don't have the faith to eat the meat, don't eat the meat. And that I don't want to do anything that causes your faith to stumble. So how do we love each other well enough to allow each of us to grow and mature? And this will take, everybody wants sudden change. It may take 100 years for us to continue to embrace what God has for us. Again, we believe in such a binary world that if I'm growing and believing and trying to understand, that we live in a world that says, no, you're right, I'm wrong, you're wrong, rather than going, okay, how are you processing? How am I processing? What's that look like? And it appears today that we have very little respect for each other and where we might be in the context of that. So I don't personally like the word deconstruction because I don't think it needs to be tore down. I think she needs to be reformed, continue to grow, continue to build. And you're right, people that have been hurt by the church, they're trying to fix her. We have to appreciate that, but you can't disregard the traditions of the church. You can't walk away from them. You have to somehow live in the tension of that. That's hard.
Well, I think it's just understanding that I am the church.
Yep.
So instead of me looking towards something else that needs to be torn down and corrected, is that maybe there is thoughts, perceptions, prejudice, preferences in my own world that maybe I do need to pull down or apocalyptically be revealed to me, that maybe those have limited me and my expression in my faith. But that the whole point of the faith is this is a journey, that I'm constantly growing and moving. And so this idea that I can tear it down one time, and I remember thinking I wanted to own a home, and now as a young adult, and we've been in one home for 13 years, I'm thinking it's still not right. We've lived in a house. So faith will never be perfected this side of heaven. No. And so I think one of the things that I find limiting about this deconstruction movement is that I'm trying to deconstruct somebody else or something else versus simply looking inward going, man, God's just revealing something new to me. And to look at that in this beauty of an individual that's part of a greater whole. And how that maybe as God reveals to me, you brought up it was a prophetic word given to the church back in May of 2008, and the limiting things in your life being removed.
Right.
And I think that throughout history, both in Scripture and through our history, we've seen how as one man stood up, Martin Luther King Jr. stood up and recognized the freedom that was accessible for his people, and he made a difference for an entire group of people. And Martin Luther King Jr. is Maya Angelou, Martin Luther, Paul, they're scripture and current people that have made up their minds that the limiting systems around them that might be limiting a group of people, that they can see something bigger. And I think there's something beautiful about someone who chooses to live in the understanding of not just church history and this future prophetic, but not even cutting off my own history, celebrating my own history that's been passed to me by the generations of grandparents and great-grandparents, and also knowing that I can call forth that maybe it would be even better for my children and my grandchildren. But I don't have to dishonor the faith in which that was handed to me.
Well, and everything you just said about particularly Martin Luther King, right? You can't tell Martin Luther King's story of the 50s and 60s without mentioning a name that the minute I say it, you're going to remember it, Rosa Parks.
Absolutely.
So if I say Rosa Parks, we have to recognize that Rosa Parks wasn't taking a stand against the bus company. Rosa Parks was discovering that she was equal to. She had been given this idea that she was less than. And so when Rosa Parks sits down on the front of the bus, that's a revelation of now she knows who she is. And if her awareness of who she is, that's liberating, right? She broke through that day because she broke down through those limitations of her own self-identity. The real story is that Rosa Parks broke out of those deceptions and lies that had been told to her that had shaped her. And everybody thinks Rosa Parks was protesting against. And I understand she was, but really it was a breakthrough into who she was. And if that created a chain reaction in the mindsets of other people, so be it. What has to be celebrated is that Rosa Parks that day says, I can sit on the front row.
But don't you think that's the beauty of faith, is to come and reveal to us who we truly are?
Well,
so when I have this apocalyptic moment and I realize the limiting things that have held me back, it does create a chain reaction in other people's lives.
But that's not why we do it.
Right. I mean, it happened to Abraham, right? When Abraham realized, why did you call me? Moses, David. I mean, the scriptures are full of people that were asking, why me? And yet God...
So when I come into the realization of my own identity in Christ, when I recover my true identity in Christ, I don't do that to be opposed to you. I don't do that to be... I really don't need you to do anything. Okay? Rosa Parks didn't need anybody to do anything. She was coming into the freedom who she was. Now that we know that created the beginning of a movement. And so one person coming into the understanding of who they are in Christ, of recognizing they're the beloved, one person breaking out of those limitations of whatever, one person coming into that, I'm a child of God. That creates a movement for a lot of other people. That's the way systemic issues are resolved. You'll never legislate those things. It is one person going, I am. It's John Lewis going, I am. It's Martin Luther King going, and that's created a movement. So that's just one picture of a social issue, right? That's just one social issue that is merely a representation of the fullness of, if one person comes into the knowledge of Christ, that God loves them and loves them without condition, that there's no, and they come into that, that's freedom. Now, is that a breakthrough for them? Yes. Could that individual breakthrough be a breakthrough for society? Could be. I can remember, honey, when I started preaching, I was always thinking, does this preach well? Does this teach well? Today when I speak, number one, I'm thinking about what do you need? And does it shape you? Does it help you recover who you are? Not who I project you need to be, but who Christ created you to be. And then to recognize we have to be patient. Thank God Rosa Parks was patient. Thank God John Lewis was patient, right? And we're just describing one social issue. This is not even, it's even as I say it's not even big enough to encompass what I'm saying. If we teach people to live in daily fellowship in the unconditional love of God, then every day my character is being shaped and formed, and maybe my own discovery of who I am may help others to confront those limitations. Now I'm not fighting an institution. Now I'm not deconstructing an institution. Now I'm growing and maturing as a child of God, and I have to believe that that will help all of humanity. That is Abraham, as Isaac and Jacob, as David, as Hosea, as Peter, Paul, as all of us continually mature in who we are in God. I think that's the kingdom coming and the will of God being done. We want it done now. We want it fixed now. And it's not going to be. So the Father's house. The Father's house is living to be rooted in the ancient truths of God, rooted in the faith of Jesus Christ. We're trying to live in the rhythms, in the habits, in the practices whereby we are always conscious and aware of God's presence in our lives. And we're in relationship with other people on this journey. I think the only way you live in any crisis, in any time frame. My grandparents lived through World War I, World War II. They were rooted in what they knew to be God. They practiced these rhythms of prayer and of giving and of fellowship, and they were connected to a local church. They lived in relationship. Those three things will empower us to live in whatever generation we're called to live in, and maybe we make contributions. I got to think we do to the bigger thing. So the Father's house is a great experiment. It's a huge experiment for me to reach out and say, listen, my Roman Catholic brothers are my brothers. And to break through the prejudice of evangelical Protestant Pentecostals that think Roman Catholics are not Christians, when in truth they are. And so it's a big experiment to reach out and say, wait a minute, the church is bigger than this little building on 20th Street.
Don't you think one of the greatest lies that has limited individuals is that unity is not full agreement?
Correct.
So define the word unity separate from, that means I agree with you on every single thought, action, word, belief system in your life.
Well,
or that we use the word unity synonymous with same. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, division is diabolical, as a friend of mine says. Division is diabolical. Diversity is divine. So let's understand there are diverse expressions of God. God made people of different race, creed, color, tribes, and tongue. So we're diverse, and we see things from different perspectives. We're not in complete agreement about the color of your hair, but that does not divide me from the reality that you're part of the human race and that I'm part of the human race. And so we are connected by the very basis that we are the image of God. And
so this idea that I have to divide from you because I don't agree with you on this topic or that topic might be a great lie that's actually hurting or limiting.
It's evil.
Spreading the gospel.
Well, it's evil. The idea in my country right now that if you're not of my party, then you're not American enough. That's evil. And that if you're not of my doctrine, and listen, we all have to have a doctrine. I get it. You have to have your Baptist. I have to have whatever. But when the doctrine divides me from being your brother or your sister, I'll quote Pope Francis again. We're brothers by baptism, There's none of us sitting here that aren't saved by grace. If it's not by grace, we're not there. So I can disagree in a lot of different areas. That doesn't mean that I can't break bread with you. That doesn't mean I can't worship with you. That doesn't mean that I don't share life with you and carry food to somebody's funeral. Doesn't mean that we don't go down. No, we share life together and respect the diversity that's among us. Because what's more evil in the church is that I take a stand against a brother than it is that I disagree with the way they would interpret the Scriptures. Heresy.
Well, isn't that so contradictory to just the New Testament? I mean, Christ and Paul, it was the Jews and the Gentiles. I mean, Paul spent most of his ministry almost trying to convince the Jews and Gentiles
to be one.
And Christ says, I came to save all, not this one group. And here we are sitting in the 2,000 years later, and the church is having almost same conversations.
Well, the Jesus, everybody wants to say that the Our Father is the Lord's Prayer. Well, quite frankly, it's the way He taught us to pray. But His final prayer in John 17 is that we might be one, that the world might believe. If we're trying to bring other people in the kingdom of God, we got to get our act together. And as long as we remain divided, then the world's going to look outside of us and go, what's the point? So the church has got to decide, and I'm not talking about institutionally. So the people
of God.
People, each individual has got to decide, my bond of love for you is so deep that I refuse to be separated from you. Honey, you know this. Everybody I've ever pastored, I think we're lifelong friends. I think we're a lifelong relationship. I just can't imagine. I just can't imagine breaking relationship, even if I disagree with you vehemently. I just can't imagine us not breaking bread together, celebrating, worshiping together. And if we do, then our gospel loses its power. So love doesn't say, I love you as long as you agree with me philosophically or theologically. Love says, I love you even if you nail me to a cross.
Okay, so the shibboleth of the Father's house is?
To love each and every human being unconditionally, without demand or measure.
So we're doing a current push as we talked through starting 2022. And you made a statement to Sean about it was the Sunday of love during Advent.
Yep.
And you said, I really just want to stand up and say, love each other and sit down. That there were no more words than to look at a group of people and say, just love. There's a verse we're using. What is the... it's in 1 John 4, where it says, they will know you are my disciples by your love for one another. And not how I pray, not how I act in the worship service, not how I behave on Monday, not how much money I have in my bank account, or what car I drive, or what house I have, or which church I go to, or it is how I love the person next to me.
Well, it's easy to love as long as you're treating me kind.
Man, it's conditional.
It's easy to love you as long as you're making me feel good, right? That's human love. If this, then that. If you treat me nice, then I'll love you. If you don't treat me nice, I'm cutting you out. So that Sunday, I remember it really well. I looked at Sean and said, listen, I have a 2-word sermon. Love one another. When you've said and done everything there is to said and done, the Father got very quiet for 400 years. So when God ran out of words, because He did, I have no more to tell you. And He got silent. And the next thing you hear John saying is, the Word became flesh. So until love is personified in our actions, and so when love didn't really come to say much, love came to reveal. And the essence of love was revealed when Christ spread His arms on a cross and died for those that were killing Him. So He refused to break with humanity. He refused. Everybody's waiting for God to come and judge. He's already judged. I want to say to everybody that's waiting for God to come and judge somebody, He already has. He judged us on the cross and gave us mercy. The Father's house, as long as I am here, is going to find a way to give mercy to every human being, regardless of. I'm not trying to change an institution. I'm trying to call you into this journey of loving one another the way God has loved you. Will that change institutions? I don't know. I don't know. That's not my calling. My calling is to come and love the world the way He has loved me, and to love every individual that way. How they do that is up to them. And, whether or not that makes an impact outside of the four walls or outside of our influence, that's up to God. That's not up to me. That's up to God. So the very simplest early form that we used to say is that we are here to create an atmosphere, an environment of unconditional love where every person can discover, develop, and be deployed to their highest and full potential in Christ. That's a fancy way of saying we're trying to lead people in walking in the unconditional love of the Father. That's a fancy way of saying it. But if you're going to come into the Father's house, you're going to see people that are very different from you. If you come into this communion, you're going to find people different from you, and you're going to find them at all kinds of stages of their own walk in Christ. And you're going to find them from every political persuasion, and you're going to find them from every angle. What we're held together by is the essentials of our faith. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. We're held together by this common reality that we are the beloved of God, and that if we practice these practices of prayer and of worship, of giving to God and to one another, that we're slowly being transformed into the image and the likeness of God, and that I have enough faith in God that I can trust Him to transform you. And listen, most people don't want to trust God to be God. They want to be the Holy Spirit and make you come into their conformed idea of what you should be. That's where deconstructionists fail before they start.
So to think of it, maybe a nice way to think about it would be, obviously you are my parent and parented, and as now a parent of 5 boys, to realize that as much as I want to pass to them faith, integrity, honesty, all the things that a parent wants to pass to a child, I actually can't force them to transform and change. That I don't even have that power over beings I helped create. And yet, one of my best friends, I remember when Shelby told me, becoming a parent is like having your heart walk around on the outside of your body, and at times not being able to protect it. And I think that is exactly what it feels like as a parent, is to see this being you created and knowing you're doing your best with the limited understandings that sometimes I had as a first-time parent versus now 13 years in, or I would assume when you've parented for 40 years, you have a different view on parenting 40 years in than you did in the first 10 years. To celebrate people's want to change, to celebrate that this is a journey, and to understand that I'm going to love my children at the place in which they can understand. I don't get mad at the 6-year-old because he can't understand what the 11-year-old understands. I can't get mad at the 3-year-old because he doesn't understand. I have to love him in the season of life he's in. And part of what I think the Father's house tries to encourage people to do is love people at the season of life they're in. They may be 60 numerically, but they may only be 3 in Christian years.
Well, I think it's you that's always talking to me about appropriate behavior for that age. So that I can't expect, I can't expect a kindergartner to be acting like a 11th grader. And most of the time we don't take time in an adult way. We don't take time to recognize where someone's at in their journey or in their context. I think as a parent, when you talk about that metaphor, I think as a parent, you try and just get the kid to do good. Just behave, right? How many times have I turned around and heard myself or you or the other kids go, would you just behave? Mm-hmm. So you're just managing good behavior. And that's all needed, right? Because you need the kid to sit down whenever. But at some juncture, you're not trying to manage good behavior. You're recognizing you are good. Mm. And how difficult it is to begin to recognize, I don't have to make you good. God made you good. You are good. You are true. You are beautiful. You are, I mean, the great movie, right? So I think as a teacher, as a teacher, as a minister, to move beyond trying to manage your behavior so that you're good, to recognize that you're already good, and that my role is to pull you into the presence of God so that you discover your inerrant, your innate goodness, that you are good, and to tear down those limiting constructs that have kept you from realizing and recognizing that goodness. The enemy comes to deceive us. I mean, from the very beginning, the great lie of all lies, if you do this, you will be like. You already are. Now trust Him to transform and mature and grow that. We have real trouble at trusting God to transform and change people's lives. That's why, again, the Father's house is to create an atmosphere and or an environment of unconditional love. If the atmosphere is correct, it'll snow. If the atmosphere is correct, then people will begin to break in and break through and grow in that.
And when you say one of our focuses would be more of a holistic approach, that our spiritual life is not separated from the rest of our life. It's not compartmentalized. That this has to be a holistic approach to the health of you talk about like the 4 tires on a vehicle of your spiritual and your mental and your physical and emotional life, and understanding that I have to understand that God wants to heal all of those places. So just as we celebrate the ancient and are rooted and anchored in a past and yet call for a future, we have to think about that individualistically as well, to understand that I don't have to be void of my past. I can see my past, the traumas, the trials, the glasses that were handed to me as a young person, and yet call forth what I want to be, and to be a bridge builder and to call forth that out of people's lives. That just because I see them in this current state, that why not speak to them and see them through the blood of Christ and call forth who they are, versus talking to them about what they're doing. I think sometimes in Christian faith, we're always talking about the sin people are doing, which is really, we're talking about their behaviors.
Right,
sin
right.
is simply me stating I don't need God. It's not the drinking, smoking, and running with the people that do. It's this mental, the apple, maybe go there. The apple wasn't the sin. It was this idea that I was incomplete.
Well, sin, we always want to
We keep trying to take apples out of people's hands.
I'm so tired of people talking about the sin. The sin followed the deception. So Adam and Eve were deceived, and then they sinned. So deception is, I come to say, you'll be happier if you go buy a new car. You'll be happier if you go whatever, right? So the deception is that your life is missing something. So all of advertisement is to suggest to you that if you go buy, go do, go conquer, that there's something that you can do, and so deceives you into thinking that you can go get the apple. And if you get the apple, your eyes will be open, you'll be like God, right? So that's the great deception. Fundamental Christianity is stuck trying to get people to stop sinning and change their behavior. Orthodox Christianity, ancient faith, is saying, let's go back here and let's fix the deception. Let's untwist the deception. Let me give you a new pair of glasses so that you can see yourself as good, beautiful, and true. As you can see yourself that you already are. So you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. The truth is not a list of doctrines. The truth is to know that you're created in God's image, that He loves you unconditionally, that He's working for your highest and best, and He will bring you into that without you doing, right? So instead of focusing on the behaviors and the sin, let's go back here and let's unlock the deceptions that have caused you to have this idea that's false about yourself.
About others, about God.
So Brendan Manning talks about that poser, that false self. I believe that true Christianity is trying to help you discover your identity, your true self in Christ, and then the behaviors we're managing the symptoms and not going back to the source. And as you know, some of those deceptions were because other people abused us, they lied to us. Some of them are religious and they handed us an incomplete gospel. There's all kinds of reasons or ways in which we've been deceived about God, ourselves, and others. And so that's a very pastoral, specific. I have to know your context.
Your story.
I have to know your story. You've heard me say it over and over again. There's always more to the story. And so if we try to take and put an institutional form over all of it, it won't work. It just won't work. It'll break down. And so now I got to deconstruct the institution. Well, ask a better question. Go a little further, go beyond the institution and recognize that we're going to have to be the good Samaritans that walk out in and pick up one starfish at a time. The institution's too big for me. I can talk to you about the people I pastor. I can talk to you about this. I can talk to you about how I'm trying to, I don't know if that's making any sense, but if we'll
So
move.
when we use the vision statement, which has been the vision statement for 30 plus years, to create an atmosphere of unconditional love where each and every person can discover, develop, and be deployed. Our intentionality at the Father's house as staff is simply to create atmospheres.
That's correct.
Our intentionality isn't to set up programs or come up with the latest, greatest, whiz-bang-ding thing. We literally spend hours in prayer, and I can say we because I'm part of the staff today, but as a bystander, I've had a front row seat to the staff of the Father's house for 35 years. It's always been out of deep prayer, sometimes a prophetic word that just said go. And so our whole goal here is to simply create an atmosphere where people come in and God reveals the true essence of who He is, and they come in encounter with. So sort of like Moses that went up on the mountain and got to see the glory of God. Our goal is to create moments where that happens for kids and young people.
So the Father's house is not driven by programs or we're just not driven by programs or politics. We're driven by one hunger. David said, "One thing I desire, and that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life and inquire of Him." So we want the presence of God. And I understand the presence of God is everywhere. There's no place that His presence is not. And yet, through the history of our faith, we can see that the presence of God became tangible, became touchable. And so the invisible became real. And so the prophet in 2 Kings said, "Bring me a minstrel that I might prophesy." So how do we host the presence of God? It's why this church is called the Father's house. It's His house. So how do we facilitate the presence of God here? When David went and brought the presence of God into the city, he had to do it a second time because the first time he didn't know how to handle the presence of God in a holy manner. And so my hunger for 35 years is, how do I facilitate the manifestation of the glory of God in such a way that it would impact you and your eyes would be open, you have an encounter with God, and it would start a journey, it'd reset a journey, it would reform the journey. Does it deconstruct you? Well, it might, I don't know. But the Father's house is centered about one thing. How do we facilitate the presence of God, not just on Sunday morning, but in your home, with your children, in your walk with Christ at work? How do I help you? I think this morning in one of my devotional books, the writer of the devotion was saying, God's not going to hand you a map of your life today. What He's going to do is ask you to walk in continual awareness of His presence. So how do we create an atmosphere for the presence of God on Sunday morning when we're gathered together corporately in this act of worship? And how do we share the habits, the practices that will allow you to remain conscious of the presence of God throughout the week? So, because I don't think you get a map of your life. I think we are handed as believers in Christ the way to walk, the way of Jesus, that we could walk this way and be really confident that God is with us. So remember, they were first called people of the way, and His name is Emmanuel. And so the Father's house has this big experiment, this great big idea. It's just an idea, honey. It's an idea that there are people here that want the presence of God tangibly, touchably, that He's interacting and healing and setting free and unlocking the lies that we've been living under. And we do that together. That's why we can't break agreement, because we walk into the room and we all know that everyone in this room is bound by some sort of deception. And so we come together knowing if we can get in the presence of God, and then we go out and live the next 6 days maintaining that in our individual lives and coming back together and having these breakthroughs. That's bigger than a program. That's bigger than some sort of system that we put in place to keep all of you. Nah, it's bigger than that. That is one goal, one focus. And you can't do it alone. No one's an island. No one's an individual by themselves outside of a community. That's why we believe in a Trinitarian God. It's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is a community, and yet He's one. You can't separate from this journey. You can't do that.
So over the course of 35 years, one of the things I've heard at times used as a criticism is that we're always changing. And I would say that I hear that word, and it is exciting to me. But I can embrace change. However, I understand that change can be hard, and not everyone necessarily embraces change quite like that. But I think as you say that, to understand that the Father's house is willing to use any method possible. If that's a youth center down on Main Street, if that's a Christian bookstore in the mall, if that's walking down Main Street with a cross, if that's doing parade, whatever the moment calls for. Most recently in the last 2 years, you and I have spent a lot of time in the community, not necessarily within the 4 church walls, but talking to hospitals and doctors and childcare workers and ministering to them through COVID-19 by taking granola bars up to the hospital. So whatever, I think one of the things that presence-centered churches do is then whatever the need or the call that God has for us today, if a value of ours is to be present-centered and to love others, what is needed today to love others? There was a day we would make 200 food baskets and take them out on Christmas. That need today in our community is not as great as it was 15 years ago. There's other needs today.
Well, I think that if you're going to live in the presence of God, there's a whole concept of purpose-driven. How about presence-centered? And listen, there was a time when we facilitated certain things. What happened was we drew attention to it, and someone else created a better structure or a better program, and they're doing it better than we did. We just did it first. And that's what a prophetic movement does.
Why don't you say, maybe you could go back and start now talking through some of the outreaches and missions. So you've done that thing about what a Christian is, and they're the 4 S's: service, submitted.
Yeah, I wear it on my hand.
Okay, no, those are the 3 streams of convergence. But you have talked before about what a Christian is. They're submitted.
They're saved.
Spirit-filled.
And they're serving. And
so wait, let's back up. They're saved, Spirit-filled, submitted,
and serving. Yeah, it's the 4 S's. Do you know Christ? Are you saved? Are you spirit-filled, where He's living inside of you? Are you submitted to someone outside yourself? And where are you serving people? And it used to be, people come to me and, there's lots of demands on counseling. Well, before you start counseling a lot of people, you ought to ask just 2 or 3 questions. Well, do you know Christ? Are you spirit-filled? Are you submitted to a local church? And are you giving? If people can't answer those 4 questions, you need to back up and just deal with those 4 issues. So a lot of times when people come to me for counseling, I'm backing up going, now wait a minute. Do you know Christ? Are you filled with His Spirit? Where are you submitted to? And where are you giving? Where are you serving? Where are you tithing, quite frankly? If you can't answer those 4 questions, there's nothing I have to offer to you. I don't have anything to give to you, because those are the essentials of the faith. Now we're talking about essentials. So are you saved? Are you spirit-filled? Are you submitted? And are you serving? If you're not, then you're wide open and targeted for a lot of things. So calling people into that lifestyle of serving God, calling people into that. He who loses his life will find it. Called to give my life away. Over 35 years, honey, what I've realized is people have substituted self-improvement for the flourishing of their own soul. And so they only submit and surrender and do something if it's self-serving. Well, the only way you find your soul is to give your life away. He who loses his life shall find it.
Here would be a question I would have is, would you today add a 5th S to that from the idea of sacramental living?
Could.
You talk a lot about disciplines. There was a season when you did a lot on, which is another one, if there were 3 teachings I want to get on camera and it's your membership class, you did a teaching years ago on tensions that just has sat in my soul. I was probably 15.
Long time. Yeah, been a long time.
And then habits. You did one on habits when we used to do that school of ministry. And I think for a long time, I remember reading the book Celebrations of Discipline and being so frustrated because as the personality type that I have wants a roadmap. So when we went to the diaconate, you could read Journey to Jesus, and then Journey to Jesus I could put in a formulaic way. It was a 1, 2, 3, 4-step process. And so my makeup as a human being fits that really well. I can check off the boxes.
Right.
And the first time I read Celebrations of Discipline, I was so irritated because I couldn't achieve it. I couldn't put it down on a marker and say, I've arrived at.
Yep.
And I think as American Christianity today, it's something we struggle with. And one of the first times that really changed was when I went to a Catholic nunnery and watched women who've lived their entire lives in a sacramental, rhythmic way. So if I ever broke a discipline, if I broke a habit, I was hard on myself. And I think our American culture does that to us. We start a New Year's resolution and we break it. Now we're frustrated with ourselves. And I think we apply that to our spiritual life versus understanding this sacramental rhythms of God, that the season, you've talked to us as staff about when you had young children at home, your prayer time and devotional time looked different than it looks at 64 with no children at home. Mm-hmm. And being able to embrace the rhythm and life that I'm in and make space, make room for God, that it doesn't have to happen at 6 a.m. for this amount of time with this amount of scriptures, but that it's this ongoing conversation with God, this.
Yeah, I think the habits that I have, or that you have, these practices, these ways of encountering, sacramental simply is how God uses a physical thing to convey a spiritual reality. So sacraments, God uses physical things to convey a spiritual reality. And so when people look at me and cross their eyes, I say, well, He created the earth. And He says, everything you can know about me can be seen in all of creation. So an invisible God created physical things so that you could know Him. And so the first thing John the Baptist did was baptize them with water. So God uses physical things to convey spiritual realities. You reach out and you touch somebody's hand, you're conveying something. So God uses baptism. He uses bread and wine to convey who He is. These physical acts, if you're Pentecostal, you anoint with oil. You lay hands on. So those physical habits. What are the habits? Do I bow? When I bow, when I kneel, my body has to stop and think, what are you doing? When I raise my hands in worship, what are you doing? So when I stop and have a specific time of prayer, when I say, no, I'm not eating that for a period of time, I'm doing something that opens a window for the graces of God to come into my life. Now, so I believe in those habits, those physical actions that convey. It's why we kiss each other. It conveys something. So when we're talking about creating space for the sacred, we live in a secular world that doesn't know how to make space for the sacred. Well, the way you make space for the presence of God, we're talking about creating an atmosphere. Okay, how do we make space for the sacred? Well, we come together, we read prayers, we sing songs, we break bread, we pray for one another. Make space for the sacred. Those habits. Well, those habits have to be contextual too. Not all of you can move into a monastery and get up 7 times a day and do that. Some of you are raising children. So can you be honest with yourself? Just be honest with yourself. Don't let an impression, what I'm really trying to do is get you to realize you have to have some kind of habit. You have to have some kind of way that you make space. It doesn't have to be mine. It can fit your season of life, your way of life, your calling in life, but you can't not have it. You have to make sacred space through these habits. So what are those? How can they be arranged in your life so that they're there? And that's how you make sacred space, by doing these sacramental acts, by your prayer, your quiet time, your solitude, your journaling, your fasting. What are those? Now that's why I'll come back to creeds, to written prayers, because I'm giving you tools. I'm trying to hand you tools. Well, try this, do this. And you're not doing it to impress God. You're not doing it to make yourself good. You're trying to create space, trying to create an atmosphere, where God can. Sometimes it's just silence, but it's not always as spontaneous or as we think it is. But it's intentional and it's on purpose. And at 64, no children at home, I can make I can do more of that.
Well, don't you find that those S's, in a lot of ways, take most of what we've even talked about today and put it in a very user-friendly model? That I must be saved. I must be spirit-filled, meaning not that I'm speaking in tongues,
No.
but rather I'm allowing God to lead and direct my life.
Right.
That I'm not in charge of what I'm doing. I'm not just, I confessed one time, but I'm actually trying to listen to what He's saying to me. That I'm submitted somewhere and that I'm serving somewhere, but that I'm also, that's not just enough, but that I have this sacramental way of trying to live life and balance those pieces together to where it's not just my faith without deeds, but that is this sort of all-encompassing.
Well, to receive the world, it's back to that comment we were saying earlier about if I view you as an object that I can get something from, okay? If I view creation as objective, that it serves me, rather than when I look sacramentally at the world and I see the sun coming up and I go, oh, that's an expression of God to me. That's sacramental. So I view the world as a gift to me, and that it reveals God to me, and that I'm in awe with everything around me, and that in some way I'm sacramental to you, that I'm a gift to you, and that the grace of God flows through me. God, forgive me as I forgive those. So once I begin to have a sacramental view of the world and of God, it changes the way I handle the world. It changes the way I handle people. It's holy. Everything is holy. So I don't.
Whether I agree or disagree with you.
I'm going to handle my sexuality different. I'm going to handle the way I deal with food different. I'm going to handle the way I deal with other people different because they're holy. They're not just objects for me to use. They're not men walking as trees. Christ touched the blind man. What do you see? I see men walking as trees. Well, you can stand under a tree for shade. You can pick the fruit of a tree. You can cut it down and build a house or build a fire to warm yourself. I don't see men as objects. I don't see the world to be used and abused and the environmental just disregarded. Now then I have to pay attention and realize, oh no. These are expressions of. So it changes. So once you begin to recognize baptism is a sacrament, it conveys a washing to me. When I break the bread and pour the wine, it conveys the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. But now all of a sudden, marriage is a sacrament. So my spouse is a gift given, and I am a gift given. Sacramentality, that subject, we can go really, really deep here because it begins to alter everything. So to live saved, surrendered to His Spirit, submitted to others, and serving others, what that does is open the door to this sacred space where everything in life now becomes sacramental. And it just, and now you're being formed and you're being transformed. And so the Father's house is trying to draw you into the kingdom of God and draw you out of the culture of the world. I'm not very concerned about changing the culture. I'm more driven to pull you into the culture of the heaven. And if I can pull you into this culture of heaven, Peter says, get out of that crazy culture. I do think an attempt to be relevant will eventually lead you to being irreverent. And there's a big pull trying to make the church be relevant to the culture. Leonard Sweet says, any attempt to be relevant will lead to being irreverent. Not really trying to fit in. Jesus didn't come to fit in. He came to call you out of and into. Lest we forget that. We have to continually walk in this grace of salvation, this presence of the Holy Spirit, this submitted to one anotherness, and the serving thereof. In that environment, we will be transformed and become. So now the church isn't a doctrine, a building, an institution. Now it's a group of people. Again, living in love with one another. The reason this interview is going on is because I don't even know how to put that in 30 minutes on Sunday morning. That's why I keep saying, if you're looking for a place to share life, don't come one Sunday and think you got it. Give me 6 Sundays. Give me 6 interactions with you. And if you spend 6 weeks with us, you're going to see 6 different lovely moments with God together. And then if you make a decision to be here a year. Walk with us for a year. And then maybe after a year, you can make a decision as to whether or not I want to share life with these people. Or I don't want to share life with these people. And so I think to begin to share life, and then I want you to understand, in my mind, I want to share life with you till I go home and be with Jesus. And then I'm going to live with you forever. I still am wounded. I thought this was forever. I still think it's forever. And I still think that we live sometimes in disagreement with one another. But so I think this is a forever deal. I'm not looking for a way out. And if I was looking for a way out, I'd have been disappointed a long time ago. But so the Father's house is this great experiment of by living in love with one another, if that's the essential, then let's do that. If that's the only thing essential, then let's do that. The many essential things, I think they take care of themselves. And I think pastoring and spiritual formation is that calling to roll one's sleeves up and go, okay, I'm going to live in the context of this community with these people, and we're going to journey through this short vapor, that thing we call life, and when we get to the end of it, we'll step into eternity and God will correct all of it. Because no matter how good I think I got this, when I step through the veil of this flesh, I'll probably have to change my mind. The simplicity of it leads to the complexity of it is really one of the points. As you take and you take our faith and you say it's in this creed. It's very simple, it's attainable, and yet it becomes very big and very eternal and very abundant. And to stay on the roller coaster of it is a real challenge.
Okay, I'm going to try and ask two more things.
Okay.
That's on this list.
Okay.
The three streams of convergence.
Well, the three streams of convergence. The beauty of the idea of convergence is that there are three basic streams of the church. Or I could say intentional Trinitarianism. There's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You need all three. You need, the only way to touch the invisible Father is through His creation or through how He reveals us. So there's this sacramental expression so that He makes Himself known through the sacraments, namely water baptism and the Lord's Supper. And then, of course, there's the Scripture. There's the Word of God, Jesus, the Scriptures handed to us. So there's this Word and sacrament that's given to us, and then the Holy Spirit. What I realized, and it wasn't just me, but back in the 50s specifically, people began to recognize that real unity was when we transcended. There are some expressions of the church that are just all sacramental. And then there's some sacraments that's just all the preaching of the Word. And then there's some segments of the church that's just all Spirit-filled, Spirit-led. Well, I need all three of those. And what I realized in my own journey was I love the beauty of liturgy and sacrament, and it speaks to me. And I'm a preacher of the Word of God. I need the Scriptures. And I'm raised with Pentecostalism and Spirit. I need all three of those working together. So convergence says the streams of God make the city glad. How do those all come together? How does the old and the new come together? To be intentionally following a God that is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and live in that convergence or that confluence where all those streams swirl, and there is the beauty of God. So the convergence movement is that, and we're trying to intentionally live that, break down the walls between those different expressions, and find that sweet spot, if you will. I think you need all three of them. And so that's the convergence movement. And so the Spirit, the Scriptures, the sacrament, and service, we've thrown all of that in there. And that's the communion that we try to live out. Maybe a great experiment, I don't know. But it's led us into lots of different, that's led us into a lot of different ecumenical conversations.
Okay. Oh.
We'll just switch it real fast and then...
Okay, so the CEC, just break it down.
Well, the CEC is a group of leaders, group of people who have committed to live in unity with one another and to, I cautiously use this word, the word Catholicity, the universality of the wholeness of the church. We want to live in the wholeness of the church. We don't want to live in the divisions of the church anymore. So the CEEC is a communion, not a denomination. We're not held together by a bunch of canons. We're held together by a commitment to be in covenant with each other on this journey towards God. And we're going to intentionally celebrate the Scriptures, the Spirit, and the sacraments, believing that they shape and form us into the image of God. And so there's a number of us that are bishops, and we each oversee give leadership is a better word, to other churches. And they're all over the world. They're in over 22 countries in a formal way and about 52 countries in footprints or fingerprints. And so we're intentionally trying to live out this call to love one another and become shaped and formed in the presence of God. And I cautiously use the word Catholic because it triggers all kinds of responses. But we are part of the whole church and not just this institution or this denomination or this expression even. And so we intentionally try to do that. I happen to be the lead of that. I speak for us most of the time. And I really believe in it. I really believe that we could bridge the differences that exist in the world. And if we can do that, maybe by example, we can encourage others. Try to break down some of those walls. I'm tired of people building walls. I'm tired of people pointing out their differences. Let's celebrate what we have in common. The Christ that saves us by grace, and the presence of the Holy Spirit that's leading us out of our selfishness into the centeredness of Christ. Can we do that? Well, of course we can. Is the CEC going to be the end all of all? No, probably not. Maybe we are just a prophetic movement going, hey, there has to be a better way. Maybe in some ways we're calling for reform. One of the reasons I keep saying I'm not a deconstructionist because I'm not trying to but I would like to see us reform and become more unified. I'm gonna cry. I'm tired of people shaking their fist at one another, saying you're not Christian enough, or you're not. Instead of shaking our fist at one another in protest, maybe we ought to reach out to one another and find that common ground.
So it's called the Communion of Evangelical Episcopal Churches.
Yep.
And those words were intentional.
Yep.
So the word communion means?
Well, communion, to live in fellowship with one another, not bound by a set of bylaws necessarily, but communion in the fellowship of the breaking of the bread. Relationships. Evangelical. Listen, we need to be sharing, Paul says, always doing the work of evangelist. It is Christ who calls us to give witness to the world of this great gospel. So evangelical, reaching out, reaching forward, not living within our four walls, but reaching beyond and doing the work of an evangelist. Episcopal speaks to not a denomination, but to the form of government. And government's not the right word. To what holds us together. We're not a bunch of people voting in somebody. That we are living under the apostolic calling of Christ, so that there are apostolic people today that are called into this thing called leadership, and that we have presbyters and ministers, and we have deacons, and so it is a shared governance. It is a consensus. It is, and yet we know that God's given us apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers. So it's an episcopal, not a democracy. It's a theocracy, not a democracy. And so that term episcopal is the way we're shaped and formed and held together. And the New Testament talks about the presbytery, this coming together of. So the communion of people loving one another, reaching out into the world, and knowing that we're being shaped and formed by leadership that is placed by God and that He works through us. Churches. And the word churches is an interesting concept. The idea that there are local churches that are connected to the one global church, so that Christ is experienced here locally, but that's not apart from the whole. That the whole and the global and the local are all one. And so that's how that name was formed. Been lots of conversations about how it could be more culturally relevant. But we're 27 years old. It's who we are.
So the CEEC internationally is made up of archbishops from around the world. As you said, we have there's a footprint in over 24 countries. that are on record.
Right.
When you say there's fingerprints, you're talking more about countries like in India, where it is, or Africa, where it's a little harder to have the way those countries work. It's harder to be as officially stated in some of those areas. Would that be a correct statement?
Well, and it's because we're not institutional. Okay, so this isn't an institutional program whereby we're going to go impose this on. So we raise up leaders. So we raise up deacons and presbyters and bishops, and we form them and shape them in this thing that we see, and we release them onto the world. And they ooze throughout the world. It's not really a program so much as it is relationally moving. And today we're in 22, 23, 24 in an organized way. So meaning that they've formed stuff within that country. Footprints means, well, we have ministers, we have presbyters and bishops operating in over 70 countries in the world. But we're not focused on giving a top-down governance to, meaning that we trust Peter and James and Paul, we trust those bishops to contextualize the message of God in their context. So in the language of Hondurans, in the culture of Hondurans, in the language and the culture of Japan, so that this has to be taken out there and it's moved into the world relationally, not organizationally. That's why our philosophy would be to push back a little bit from that hierarchy of top down. We don't have a centralized form of government. We speak together. So one of the things we would say is I speak to, with, for, and from this gathering of leaders. And we come to this kind of consensus like they did in Acts 15. And I speak for them. But we trust each bishop within his own autonomous way, or her for that matter. We have women bishops, and their own autonomous way to lead in that region, in that culture, and in that time. Quite frankly, it's earth-shattering in its model of evangelism and missions, because it goes back to the early church, right? They were scattered throughout the world. So we're not trying to be Episcopalian, we're not trying to be Baptist, we're just trying to shed this gospel. And what's interesting is my phone will ring, my text will go off, and it'll be somebody in Australia going, "Oh, Bishop, I'm part of the CEEC. I was formed and shaped under this, and I'm here, and you're our," and I don't even know what they're doing. I don't even know, but I know they were formed and shaped in the streams of God and in the message, and so they're out there and they're working. It's a loose government, really. And that's why I go, well, it's not institutional issues. These are shaping and forming issues, formed by the love of God and sent out to love for God.
So the language we use is there's this international house of bishops, which make up the CEC internationally.
Right.
And that house of bishops gathers together, most recently not in person,
Right.
because of the pandemic, but that they are, if you go to the website, are held together by
Instruments of unity.
an instrument of unity, that they just all agreed to say this is how we will be formed and will connect and be in relationship with. Because one of the things I think that you've always had a heart for before the communion was the lack of relationship sometimes that's available to people that are in ministry.
Right.
That sometimes, even if they're a part of a denomination, one of the things I think is beautiful about the international and national house, and even our local diocese, the way that is structured, is that some of those who are ordained may be pastoring in a Presbyterian church and carry a Presbyterian ordination, and or any of those. Now, you could fill in the blank with any of those different denominations, but it's just a place to relationally connect to other people that are also leading and serving, and the weight of the calling that can come for ministers. And I think that's always been a heart of yours, is to try and help people that minister.
Yeah, fly whatever flag or flavor you want, okay? What the communion is a little bigger than that, okay? So we have ministers that are operating in any number of the major denominational tribes, but again, this calling to unity, this calling to unity and diversity, to celebrate those, to live in that. And so the communion's held together by those relational values, and we refuse to be divided by. I don't think we've ever kicked anybody out. I think I can claim that today after 27. I've never asked anybody not to be here. Now, that doesn't mean that some haven't, but that's their choice because we didn't conform into their idea. Because we're not. We are a shared group of people that are trying to share the love of God with the whole world through the Scriptures, the Spirit, and the Sacrament. And I have a deep respect for them. I remember being raised in other tribes, and the guidelines, the bylaws were more important than the relationship. And in this context, it is the apostolic succession and the relationship thereof that is more important than those issues. And
so if, for example, you got on the international or national websites and saw the leadership and or different expressions, it could look differently from a church here in Hutchinson, Kansas versus a church that is in India or Europe.
Convergence can be expressed in a Pentecostal flavor. It can be expressed in a highly sacramental flavor. It can be expressed in a Baptist flavor. So convergence is not limited to a style or to an expression. Convergence is this wonderful spiritual calling of blending all three of these things together in what we think is the full expression of. But now, the Father's house is fairly low liturgically. It's fairly, but that fits the fact that we're in Kansas too. But now you can go other places and they're going to be high liturgical. When we do gatherings, we do them pretty high, meaning that when you get married, you ought to wear a nice dress, right? So many ways of expressing this. It's not a mold that we're trying to fit anybody into. It's a heart that we're wanting people to catch and to contextualize it in wherever they go in missions. So it's a movement, it's a missional movement of that.
In fact, even to clarify further, the International House has no checking account. There is no legal or financial connection with those that are a part of the International House. It is just a relational connection.
Totally.
That says we want to do life together. We want to form together. We believe in this great experiment of actually trying to live out John 17 in some sort of format in 21st century. It's an attempt to.
Yeah, it's a calling to be Catholic, universal. Again, I say that carefully. It's a calling to be one, not because we're sharing a common purse. Not because we're trying to enforce certain things on people, but because we see the value of ministry that's being worked through you, and the value of ministry is being worked through me, and can we share that relationship? Can we share each other's gifts and talents? Can we help each other? Can we stand in unity with each other? It's that. And each so the International is a gathering of those leaders. That breaks down into regional, national expressions. And each one of them begin to take upon the shibboleth of their particular leadership. So in the U.S., takes upon this particular and faces our challenges in the U.S. Because now it's hard for us to face challenges in Africa when I don't live in Africa. So it faces those.
And there's also different, as we know, the legal side of things in each country is different, and so then each country has to sort of work through their own government's
The government of Russia is
rules.
far different than the government of, and the church transcends all that, and yet has to find itself living within the context. Yeah. So it actually is a beautiful way. You know this. I'm a missionary, a pastor, but I'm a missionary. Traveled in multiple countries, have all my life. So I can remember when the Lord said, if you'll help facilitate the communion, you'll reach far more missions than you ever would alone. And so today, I mean, I've spoke with Honduras, I've spoke with India, I've been on the phone to people in South Africa. So missions is going on all the time now. I'm not just simply me going. By raising up leaders and empowering leaders and working with leaders, we're reaching, I think the last report I saw, we're planning about 3 churches every hour. Not every day, every hour. There's a new gathering taking place. That transcends anything I could do. So it's, I don't know how many people are coming to Christ every day anymore. I used to have some idea. But
So the International Church, several years ago, some people celebrated, some people might think was controversial, was the relationship that was built with Pope Francis. So talk about that a little bit, but beyond just Pope Francis, that the Roman Catholic Church is not the only large denomination that the communion has been recognized by, which is a milestone to be celebrated, is that when other, for a lack of a better word, large entities within an industry that you're working in recognize that you are actually a valid piece to that industry, that actually adds weight.
Well, several years ago, one of our bishops befriended who is now Pope Francis, Mario Bergoglio. And so one of our bishops befriended then Cardinal Bergoglio. And it was done in a charismatic setting. So it was an international gathering of charismatics. And Cardinal Bergoglio was there, and that began a relationship with one of our bishops, which emerged into a relationship with the House of Bishops. And the beauty...
Prior to him becoming Pope Francis.
He wasn't Pope at the time, he was the Cardinal. And so it created this relationship that, quite frankly, I say to my Pentecostal friends, was around being Spirit-filled and living in this Pentecostal expression of God and evangelical expression. And so here's this Cardinal of the Catholic faith who is embracing and saying, hey, we are brothers and we're sisters of the whole church. Who knew we didn't know that he would become Pope Francis. That relationship has grown to be what we think is a symbol, a sacrament maybe, of the Spirit of God that wants us to break down these barriers and celebrate the fact that we are brothers in Christ, brothers and sisters in Christ. So our relationship with Pope Francis has been, I think it's a prophetic movement that God's desire is that we would bridge across these great divides that denominations, doctrines, institutions created. So I think you see the heart of now Pope Francis and the communion, who I think God's used in a little bitty way. And so in 2017, I think it's 2017, there was a gathering of worldwide charismatics. And it was the 50th Jubilee of the charismatic outpouring within the Roman Catholic Church. And Pope Francis and the communion worked together to draw tens of thousands of people to the Vatican, to Rome, and we did this great celebration of Pentecost, and we were a big part of that. And as well as that now has connected to various other expressions of the church worldwide, the Lutheran Federation. Anyway, and I don't think any of us would say that that's going to heal all the issues between Catholicism and Protestantism, but it is a step of being a friend. So you know this. I like to say we had a bishop who befriended Mario Bergoglio. That man, Tony Palmer, was my friend. And he had a friend named Pope Francis. And so I now have a friend named Francis. It's a friend of a friend. It's relationship. I don't think I can solve the institutional connections of the world, but I can be your friend, and you can be my friend, and maybe we will recognize that Christ has called us into friendship, and that friendship is not based on a lot of things that we think it is. Friendship is a gift from God, and we choose to be each other's friends. And so this communion's relationship with the Catholic Church, with Pope Francis specifically, I think, is a foretaste of what the Spirit is trying to accomplish in the world, which is to get us to cross these bridges, tear down these walls, to open up the gates, and begin to celebrate what we have in common, which is the gift of Christ, and focus on that and love each other. And when I met Pope Francis once, he looked at me and he said, well, the music is the same. And what he was saying was, the heart is the same. And could we see each other's heart? And that'll reform the church. That'll reform it. That's not a tearing down. That's enlarging her. This is what she's for. And so, I don't know what our future relationships will be. You know this, that this little church in Hutchinson, Kansas has found itself in places that we would never have imagined, and we certainly didn't plan on. And in all humility, I keep coming back to, if we'll just love one another, God will open doors, and He'll transform us, and He'll change us. And when we all go the way of the dust, isn't that enough? Isn't it enough to be known that we were friends with people in the name of Christ and by His love? And isn't that enough? Christ died calling us friends. And I think to live in that friendship and that relationship of unconditional love, I never thought I'd find myself in the Vatican, but I did. I wonder what other walls you could tear down. I wonder what your generation holds. I wonder if you just love one another. I wonder what broken fences you could mend. I wonder what doors you could open. The possibility is endless if we'll come out of our little box and our little tribe and come out from under the lies we've been told by one another.
So we use terms like archbishop and bishop, presbyter, deacon. Just break those words down for us.
Well, I hate the word arch, just to be real blunt. Arch talks about a function. Let me talk about the word bishop and just simply talk about that. The word bishop is the word apostle, meaning an apostolic calling to give leadership oversight to those that are working in an area of. So it's the apostolic, Acts chapter 2, verse 42. They continued daily in the apostolic teaching, the breaking of bread, fellowship, and prayer. So there is an apostolic teaching. So bishops are those people that are recognized, set apart by God, by other bishops, by their church, to give apostolic leadership to and oversight of. Quite frankly, in the early church, it was the lead pastor of a large congregation. So lead pastor of a large congregation that had several other churches in the area. So that lead pastor was the bishop that kind of held that together. And then those bishops relate to one another. So there's the church, the relationship of a bishop to those giving ministry in this region, and that bishop being in relationship with another bishop giving ministry to that region. There's the church, and held together by those relationships.
So simplistically, I've heard you use the word, a bishop is simply a pastor to pastors.
Oh, just a pastor.
That I'm just pastoring pastors.
That's really all it is. A pastor to pastors. And the word deacon, servant, diaconate. We're all servants first. I have some things, but at the end of the day, I'm just a servant. At the end of the day, I'm just a deacon. And if you open up the New Testament, you'll see Paul write letters to the bishops and deacons there. So the bishop is just the servant to the servants. He just serves the servants, and the servants serve the people. That is the construct of the church. There is the church. Where the bishop is, the church is what Cyprian said. So where you see servants serving the people and servants serving each other, there's the church. Where there's the breaking of the bread and the preaching of the word, there's the church. So celebrate the death, the burial, the resurrection of the Christ, and let's love one another. And
So you have currently been serving for several years now as the presiding bishop of the International House. So you're the, for a lack of a better word, correct me if I'm wrong, the spokesperson, the person who speaks. You guys talk about the bishops gathering, and it's a to, with, for, and from. It's a praying together to find clarity on whatever may be the prayer for the moment, but that being the presiding bishop simply means you are just sort of the spokesperson for the moment.
yeah, if you go back to Acts chapter 15, all the Jerusalem council, they all came together and they all spoke, and then James stood up and he said, okay, now I've listened to all of you. And he summarized what the bishops came to agree on. I get to speak to, with, for, and from the bishops. So we gather together, we talk together, and then I speak from that place. And that's the presbytery and that's really what the House of Bishops does. I've served as the presiding bishop for the USA province since 2011, and for the international representatives since 2016.
So one of the things that is, I don't know that I have the right word for it, but a foundational piece of the communion is apostolic succession.
Right.
So talk through that.
Well, apostolic succession is a big word, old word, to talk about how Christ laid hands on the original 12, and then they laid hands on others, and they passed the leadership of the church to the early church fathers, to later fathers. So it's that tracing of the anointing of God back to Christ himself. And throughout history, that lineage can be followed. And that anointing of laying on of hands can be followed all the way back to Christ. And it's very historic. It's very easy to follow. And so that leadership is not something that you put on yourself. It's not something that a bunch of people get together in a back room and do. It's something that's traced from Christ. I want to be real careful even in that explanation to say, I don't know that that's essential for ministry. I think there are a lot of people leading ministry in the world today that are not in apostolic succession. But I think it's beneficial. I think it's beneficial to know that you're connected to the roots of the church. And so there are several expressions of apostolic succession in the world today. The communion is just a small part of that, actually. And so I cherish this gift because it connects me to, and the anointings that came through it, I cherish and I value. It's important to me. I would not diminish somebody that's not in apostolic succession, because I can tell you where the church is. I can't tell you where the church is not. I can point to, but listen, God breaks all barriers and goes in places that I don't even know. So even as I talk about it, it's valuable to us. We cherish it. We consider it a gift. But we certainly don't think it makes us elite. We certainly don't think it makes us better than anybody. So it's that ability to trace back. I can trace back that laying on of hands to Christ, and it's valuable to me.
So you said the communion is 27 years old, which would be more so towards we have this international communion that it's grown into, but it actually started right here in the United States in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So talk about the birth of the communion and those men who sit on the with you on that international house and how they birthed this dream.
Well, the dream of convergence for this communion started about 30 years ago with 3 pastors who were discovering how to live in the expression of all 3 streams coming together, of discovering the teachings of the early church, of discovering the gift of the Eucharist, the breaking of the bread. And so they were practicing it in their local churches, right? And some of them were vineyard people, Some of them were Word of Faith people. One of them was from the Reformed expression. And they began to share those ideas with each other. And they were reading behind Bob Weber and Leslie Newbigin and Tom Oden and academics that were breaking into this. And so they held a conference or two, and about 70 people from that States came to Peter Gilchrist, Tom Oden. And out of that hunger, then the communion was born. And when that happened, what they discovered was there were a lot of people asking these questions. And today there's several communions like this that are trying to live this convergence call. And so it came right out of Oklahoma, Kansas, these 3 or 4 that were trying to live this and express that. No one had any clue that it would grow into what it has, or that it would spawn off over into even other communions, and other people would take and do other things. So it was just a prophetic movement of 3 pastors that were attempting to live this. And today, it represents a number of people around the world.
And so obviously the National House, the CEC USA, has a little different structure, more form to it because of the laws of the land, for lack of a better word. And so we are all across the United States, but then can be represented through different dioceses. So we have this communion, but then we have the Diocese of the Restoration here locally.
Yeah,
So
each nation then has its own house of bishops, and that's made up of bishops in the U.S. that have their own groups of churches that we refer to as dioceses. And so there's a number of bishops in the U.S. that then facilitate leadership development churches within their own group. And then those bishops meet together in what's called the USA House. And so it's structured in that way. So there's a set of canons that oversee the USA, so there's some guidelines is a better word, I think. And then each diocese breaks that down into each local expression. And each one of those groups have their own focus. They have their own
shibboleth, maybe.
They have their own shibboleth. Their bishop, and they have their own intentional, specific calling to whom they call to, and can look different from diocese to diocese, even in the United States. So again, it's a missional movement that's taking these ideas and these concepts and moving them out into the grassroots. And so it's a very diverse group of people that will remain diverse, for that matter, and express the gospel in Laodicea, in Constantinople, in Samaria, in the uttermost parts of the world. So again, it's not a top-down controlled expression. It is a trusting of relationships into those areas. So,
one of the things that has been maybe something that has been cherished by everyone who is a part of the communion is the ministry, the outreach that's happening in the armed forces through a chaplaincy program. So talk just a little bit about how the communion's footprint serves our armed forces.
Well, the province, Communion USA, we have a chaplains department. We have a bishop that oversees chaplains both in the Department of Defense as well as chaplains that are working in hospitals and corps. Chaplaincy is becoming a huge need, not only in the Department of Defense, but in many just local areas, right? So I don't know the exact number, but we have a number of chaplains that work in the Department of Defense, and some of them have some really, really great assignments. We have a gentleman that was working Walter Reed. We have a gentleman that's in one of the main areas of the South Pacific. And listen, these chaplains give care to an average of about 3,000 troops at any given time, each one of them. That's phenomenal that they are embedded right within our armed forces and are taking care of the spiritual needs. And interestingly enough, think about it, in the armed forces, they have to give care not to this tribe or to that tribe, but to all the different flavors. So convergence empowers them to be able equips them, a better word, equips them to reach across those denominations, because you have to do it within the Department of Defense. So it's really one of the real highlights of the communion.
And yet something that can't well be documented because of some of the places those armed force men and women are located.
Yeah,
And so
we don't put up a lot of pictures or talk about a lot of it just because of the nuances of, just because of the nuances of
just
armed
some of the
forces.
truth, even with some of the missions work. We've got a female missionary who does a lot of work in China.
Yep.
And so sometimes the current American church culture is the more pictures you have and the more social media presence you have, the more mission work maybe you're doing. But there are, the truth of the matter is, number one, maybe because of where that work's being done, it can't be. But number two, your team around you have talked to you regularly about the fact that you're not real great at that anyways. Like, you're just in it to do the work. You're not looking for someone to be taking a picture and make sure it gets on a social media platform. You're just taking care of the person at the coffee shop because they need cared for.
There's a question of missions and where we're at is so nuanced. Number one, there's certain missions that are done in countries of the world where they are martyred, where their lives are in danger, where it has to be done intelligently. So if we go into areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan, it is a very clandestine work. And it's not institutional, and it's from house to house, and it's from person to person. So we can't talk about that a lot. You go into China, you go into other parts of the world. So there's not a lot of pictures to send. There's not a lot of things to post. For the safety of the people doing the ministry, for the safety of those people coming to Christ. And there's still lives that many times are put in danger. And no, I don't talk about it a lot because it's I just don't talk about it a lot. Number one, because it's just not wise for the people that are doing it, and yet to know that the gospel is spreading around the world, and we might be a small part of that. My heart goes out today for a missionary that we have working on the border of America and Mexico. And with all of the swirling opinions about what goes on the border of this country, we have a missionary there right now trying to help children, help families in need, and it moves beyond the conversation of the social and political nature of America. It speaks to the calling of Christ and His church to just meet the human needs of the people that are present. It's not taking sides to anything. And I find that trying to explain things like that to the public generally get me in trouble. And they generally try to get me to explain things that I don't really have the time nor the energy to waste on. So, nope, we don't post a lot. We just take care of the people and try to raise up. And I just got a phone call yesterday from a man in Honduras. He can buy 67 meals for $1. And so wants to know if I would be interested not in buying the meals, but could I help pay for the shipping of the container that contains the meals? And he has his own ministry. I'm just partnering with him in that endeavor. And so if you're in the Father's house, every once in a while you hear me say, hey, would you like to send a little money to Kentucky? Would you like to give a little money to help? We're not going to take any pictures. There's nobody going to put us in a magazine. We're probably never going to get credit for it. But that's the Father's house. That's the shibboleth of the Father's house. It's not going to get a lot of attention.
It's definitely not a program. Missions is not a department that has a committee that is working through that. It's, if a need arises today, then we'll meet that need, whether that's locally, whether that's within the confines of America or outside of.
You and I heard a great business model of this, honey. We were listening to a guy that's been in the hospitality industry for years and years and years. And we asked him about certain things. I think he worked for Disney. And he said one of the things that Disney does not have is a customer service department. Because he said everybody is in customer service. We don't really have a program that we call missions or outreach, because we're all missionaries and we're all in outreach, whether we're in Hutchinson or whether we're in Kansas or whether we're in Honduras. And wherever there's a need, and if we have the ability to do it, we're all missionaries. And I think, you'll know probably who we were talking to, but it talked to me that day. I thought, we don't have this department or that department. We're all in that. And so if you're a member of the Father's house, you're all servants. You're all missionaries. If you're waiting to fill out a form so that you can, no. In my opinion, you're all part of the Father's house family. We're going to try to meet the needs, whether it's the soup kitchen, whether it's laundry love, or whether it's shipping food to Honduras, or whatever it is. If I find out about it, I'll let you know.
So when we say our goal, our vision is to create an atmosphere that in unconditional love, people can discover who they really are, who God is, who each other is, and that they enter into this life rhythmic process journey where I just simply fulfill the Great Commission. I just go. So if God spoke to me and said, go, take care of this need today, or take care of that, I don't necessarily need to, not just are we raising up leaders in the church, we want to raise up leaders in families, leaders in McDonald's, and leaders in childcare classrooms, and leaders in doctors and nurses, and wherever God puts us today, that we might.
Could you just live with Jesus? Could you just love like Jesus? Could you just be available?
I heard Christine Kane one time. I went to a female pastors conference with a very small group of people, and she talked about the story of Samuel, which is always a story in the Bible that I just love, and how God just called and he just answered. And she tells her own ministry story, and it reminded me so much of yours. And so my next question, that maybe we can end here because we've been talking now for 3 hours. There's got to be a point where y'all are tired of this. But this idea that she was just available. She tells a story that before anyone knew the name Christine Kane, before anyone bought a book with her name on it, the youth pastor asked for someone to help come clean out the closets in the youth room. And she was the only person that showed up. And she said, just through talking, he just started to ask me my story and what my dreams were. And I shared with him that I wanted to tell, she had such a love for Jesus. She just wanted to tell anyone. And we've met those people, right? The missionary you're talking about that's on the border, I can remember when she just came and cleaned the toilets of the bathroom. And when the tsunami hit, she said, you looked around a room and said, well, I need to find someone that'll go. And she raised her hand. Is that Christine Kane tells the story of just, I only spoke that week because he heard my story and the heart and desire I have. And I was the only one that showed up. Yep. And it made me think of some of your stories. So just briefly, 35 years. Where did you start? How'd you get here?
Honestly, trying to think where to even start the story. I wanted to be a Lutheran pastor, raised by Pentecostal grandparents, really, Pentecostal parents, and I wanted to be a Lutheran pastor. And when those people realized that I was a little more than Lutheran, it was nerve-wracking. And so we went to this little bitty church in Derby, Kansas, and the pastor there asked me if I'd help him clean the building, and we did. And then he asked if we'd serve in the nursery, because as you know, we made up half the little nursery, little bitty room. And so we did. And then they wanted to know if we'd help do children's church, and so we did. And then it was the junior high class. And my old mentor just kept encouraging me, well, son, wherever you can find a place to serve, wherever you're at, just serve. So we did. We helped clean that little building. We helped repaint the nursery and do the nursery. We did children's church with junior high class, and I found myself doing an adult Bible study. And they would come to our home. And I remember one Friday night, this gentleman walking out of my home, and he grabbed your mom and I, And he said, "You're the best pastors we've ever had." Well, honey, I was working full-time job. I would tell people that wherever you find yourself, wherever that little circle is, you be faithful in that circle. And you do everything you can do within that circle. And when you do, God will enlarge that circle. And you do everything within that circle that you can do. So from taking care of that little building and serving in that little nursery to sitting in front of Pope Francis and trying to help what I consider to be some of the finest bishops and missionaries in the world. I didn't plan that. Just was faithful where God placed me. So my statement to people is just be faithful where God places you. And if you're in that, just do it the very best you know to do it. And if God wants to enlarge that, He will. If He doesn't, then stay faithful in the place that He's placed you. And I've stayed in Hutchinson, Kansas, because this is the place He placed me. When I watch people jump all over, I'm not real impressed. I am grateful to the Father's house. I'm grateful to the people that just realized that God was doing something in our lives that might have a worldwide impact. I will remain faithful to here because they remained faithful to me, and God used us a little bit. My encouragement to everybody today is you are a minister. You are called. God is working with you. Whether you help us change diapers back here, whether you help us go on missions trips, whether you help build the building, whatever it is, together, as we love each other and love God and love the world, we can make a huge impact. And so just focus on where God's placed you. Maybe your time of life you're raising kids. Maybe your time of life you're retired. I don't know. But don't allow the pressure of everything else to tell you you're not important or that you're not doing something. I remember Ruby Nielsen. She lived on Social Security, and she'd do bake sales and she'd raise the money. And it's what allowed me to go to Mexico 2 or 3 times. She made a difference. She made a huge difference. And I'm grateful for the Ruby Nielsens. I'm grateful for the Ethels and the Coras. I'm grateful for the Gary Porters. I'm grateful for a guy by the name of Ray Hoover who loaned me a car when I didn't have a car. Whatever it is you do, God sees it, and it makes a difference, and it matters. And the Father's house is just full of that. That's all we are. Not a big program. Nothing to think that if every church did that would change the world.
So it's 1985. You have 3 children under the age of 6. You've built a brand new home. You're flying over across the country building Holiday Inn Expresses. Teaching in a nursery. Yeah. How do you become a pastor in Hutchinson, Kansas?
Grace of God. My dad was a contractor. We did a lot of building. And Daddy went home to be with Jesus real quickly, just real suddenly. And that void in our lives caused me to realize that God had a calling on my life. And I was praying one night. It was very emotional. And it felt like everything in the world was going away, the business. And the Lord spoke to me and said, I want you. He said, I want you. And within just a few weeks, there was this opportunity to teach at a little bitty church here in Hutchinson, Kansas. And I knew that we were to be here. And so God has a way of transitioning you into His journey. And when we came here, the Lord told me to lay down my tools. And I had some talent, had some ability. And the Lord said, I want you to lay that down. And so we landed here. We fit here, right? We sat down. And in the first 90 days, I went into this very intense cycle of prayer. And when I came out of that cycle of prayer, the church was growing. And so how do you move from here to here? prayer. A relationship with the presence of God that filled a little pickup one day in the center of Wichita, Kansas, and said, "I want you." I had no idea where that was going to go. Still don't. But if you just surrender that presence in prayer, God will order every step, direct every way. You know, there's a proverb. Your brother asked me about this proverb not long ago. It says, "Man makes his plans, but God directs his steps." I had all kinds of plans. But the truth of the matter is, you make whatever plan you want to, but you better always put your trust in God, because He'll take you where He wants you to go. So I make all kinds of plans, you know this. I make all kinds of goals. At the end of the day, even after I make the goals, I got to trust that God navigates me through those to where He wants me to go. You and I can giggle back and forth. You'll set up all kinds of programs and systems, and I'll be looking at you going, "Well, that's cool." Because I do think there's something to be said for staying in the presence of God in prayer and letting His voice direct you every moment. And
So November of 86 is when you were voted in as pastor.
Yeah.
What would have been Abundant Life
Yep.
Pentecostal Holiness Church at
Yeah.
the time.
Yep.
And so there's 27 people in a little shotgun church building down on 11th Street, 10th Avenue. So from 86 to 96, I think your first board meeting, y'all voted to never vote again. So
Yep.
we're not a voting church,
Nope.
but that there is a board of elders and a board of trustees that keep accountable and help understand the spiritual direction. So from 86 to 96, the church obviously grows, build a building that now sits there today. But then the board comes to you and tells you they want you to build another building for more people.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not keen on that idea initially. And so one of the statements I've heard you say is you refused to build a building that was going to be used twice a week. And so you simply looked back at, I think it was called the Board of Ministry at the time, and said, "Come up with an idea for me that lets us utilize this building."
I did.
And Abundant Life Child Care Center is born
Yep.
in 1997 when we build this building. So maybe talk about just the first 10 years of how you go from 27 people to...
Well, I think 1986 when we came, there were few people. There was a huge movement of prayer and just really miraculous little events that happened the first year or two. And through no real direction of my own, I ended up in Mexico and began to lead small groups into Latin America. And in that first 10 years, we invested hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars and led mostly youth trips in and out of Mexico, and we planted 52 churches. And we started a Bible school, and then we were taking adult trips, and then I was doing conferences. And so I was out of Hutchinson a week a month, really, from about 1988. Your little brother was born. From about 88 to 96, I was on the road, and then that morphed into Europe and South Africa, and I was just really trying.
You went to Cuba in that time,
and went
Russia.
to Cuba, Russia. Yeah, we right in that era. The communist countries were coming free, and so we were.
Because you were one of the first pastors allowed in Cuba?
I was the first commissioned from the government of Cuba. So there'd been people going in and out of Cuba since 1958, but I was the first one that sought permission from the Cuban government to go in. And that little movement of churches created a whole church growth thing in Cuba. Same thing with Russia. We were going in and out of there just as communist Russia fell. So that 10 years, the church was growing exponentially, but it was in conjunction with all the work in missions that we were doing. And what I knew was that our growth was connected to our willingness to reach the world with the gospel. I've lost track of the number of countries we were in. I think we did 107 missions into Latin America in that 10 years. I think that's the right number. And I know there were 52 buildings built during that season. So when we looked up in 1996 and the local leadership said, we have to build a building, well, that cut into my travel. That cut into that. But we did, and we stopped, and we built this building, and it didn't make any sense to me to build a $2.5 million building and use it on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. It just didn't make any sense. So when you look at missions worldwide, and we're taking care of children worldwide, and you know this, we were taking shoes and clothing to children all over, everywhere we could. And yet when I looked into Hutchinson, there was a real lack of not just childcare. If you remember, we tried to start a school at the same time. There was a real lack of trying to take care of children within our community. And so the call to build the building was also a calling to look up and say, how do we help the children in our own community? Well, there was a real need for two-income families to have a place that they could bring children. And so the daycare, the school, as well as you remember, that youth center started all about the same time. And we really focused on children. And what has maintained for the last 26, 7 years is this serving of children in our community. It's changed and grown and expanded, and it's been difficult to support at times, but unbeknownst to me really at the time was how much of a need there is not only in our local community but in the world today for childcare. And there again, I think that we were prophetic in that statement. Today you hear a lot of people talking about childcare. 20-some years ago, it was a real sacrifice to step in and try to do it. So I still consider it our primary local mission, that oftentimes is not viewed as a mission or as an outreach. But all you have to do is go talk to the 25 years of parents that have brought children here, or the children that have come here that were in great need. You can see the fruit of it after 2.5 decades of doing that. So the building shows that where, the building shows all of that, but it's because it's used every day. And it's just used every day.
And today the Child Care Center is the largest one in the community. We've kind of become the industry standard now here locally, which we say actually very humbly. I'm not even sure when that happened.
Yeah, I don't know.
But we now spend a lot of time trying to help other places start or make decisions about, as well as we care for over 140 children on a daily basis and their parents.
Well, I think today it's obvious that you do something 2.5 decades and you acquire a little experience, a little knowledge, and hopefully today we're able to give a little bit of leadership to the community and maybe even beyond the community, serve as a model for how nonprofits could engage in the needs within their community. And so today the size of it, the scope of it, the influence of it has grown beyond anything we ever thought it would, right?
And yet I think you and I know the stories, right? So we have the Brenda Welches who gave 19 years of her life.
Yep.
And kept baby books of the 192 children she cared for, and that women that give 19 years of their lives at $8 an hour to take care of kids, that's not just the Heart of Us and the Shibboleth of Us, but the teaching staff here, many of which that don't even come to church, the ministry we do into their lives.
I think you can't talk about the Father's house, you can't talk about the communion, you can't talk about the child care without recognizing those nameless people that somehow bought into those callings themselves. Brenda's a good example, 19 years, something like that, in a nursery with 6 babies, and kept track of each one of them for all those years. That's just true for anything we've done has been done by nameless people. It's not something I've really done. It's the ability to cast a vision that other people can buy into. They carry it, and
but it's been even more so, I think, sometimes people might wonder it's a business model when we know very much you don't get into the childcare industry if you want to make money. You're almost guaranteed to lose. But the outreach that's been where we've paid for mental care, mental health for children and or staff. We've put food in the back of staff members' cars or paid for utility bills, that the outreach of that, the care we've been able to invest in kids and parents and teachers over 2 decades went beyond even just childcare.
Oh, I think childcare is the vehicle, right? I think you could take this conversation and point out to those,
What are the nets you're using? We've used a teen center. We've used concerts.
yeah, I just think that childcare, again, is one of those things, childcare, elder care. If COVID did anything, it caused people to pay attention to those unappreciated areas of our society in America. So who's taking care of the most precious commodity that we have? Our children. And how do we do that? Well, we do it by paying minimum wage. And so the most precious commodity that any country generation has is their children. And in the wealthiest country in the world, we pay the people that take care of them minimum wage. And then we expect to make changes in the culture of our children. Well, that is ludicrous. At the very least, it's unaware. At the very worst, it's criminal. And so, what a better area for the kingdom of God to engage in. What better area could the resources of buildings and bodies and budgets be used? We talk about missions, we talk about outreach, we talk about reaching the world for Christ, and yet here is this untapped reality. The government's not doing it, they're arguing about it. Communities are handcuffed by the problem. And I am not at all ashamed to be an advocate for this reality, particularly when you're having to try to meet what other people think are the standards. When the truth of the matter is, this congregation, the people that have worked for us, that have made huge sacrifices to see that take place, that is the heartbeat of missions, of creating an atmosphere where people can receive the unconditional love of God. It's easy in the top of this conversation to make those statements. The way that is put into the flesh is by walking it out in the ways that we're talking. The way we've tried to do that is by recognizing the need of these children. Now I can take that to the other spectrum. And when they reach 85, and now then we're paying CNAs $8 an hour to take care of sometimes the greatest generation in the world. Both of those areas, by and large, our society has not paid any attention to. And the early church, the ancient church, were the ones that stepped into the first century and picked up the throwaway children that parents didn't have the money to raise and took responsibility for the bearing of the old. Not the Roman Empire, not the leaders, but the church. I think today, 21 centuries later, the church is at a crossroads. Instead of arguing about who they think is in and out, they ought to just pick up the towel and take care of the children and take care of their elderly. That's the best way we can show love in America today. If we do, then the church might have a voice. She might have a voice. She might have an influence. You and I are living that right now in this little community. Maybe. maybe it'll be heard by others. And maybe we can bring attention to the need for child care, the need for elder care. And I'm not saying there aren't other needs. I'm just saying those of where we found ourselves, and I've spent nearly my entire career advocating those two things locally and somehow keeping our eye on the ball when it comes to missions that we use the communion to do. So maybe the church ought to raise the flag for those in need, those that are on the marginal edges of our life, those that are forgotten. It's interesting to me that in the last couple of years, everything that's got all the attention, and it needs and it deserves attention. I'm not saying it doesn't. But children and older people, no one's marching in the streets for them. No one's really beating the drum for them. So you have to beg. You have to beg for this to be funded. I'm very, very proud of the Father's house. Very humbled by the people that have let us bang the doors in the building, scratch the building, and stayed loyal. I mean, I can remember 20-some years ago, people left the church because we were scratching the building we had built. Well, I was not going to spend $2.5 million for a building to be used 3 times a week. That was silly. And I wasn't going to be so afraid that your children coming on Sunday morning might catch a cold because we had people in that building through the week. So, it's been interesting, to say the least.
Well, and I think that speaks to, even when you talk about that kind of price tag on a building, the Father's house, you have said before, has always been supported by consistent giving. That it's never been the big givers, it's just been consistent givers.
Consistent blue collars.
We've never spent big money anywhere. And so to spend that kind of money to build a building, even as we say that, part of the reason why it would have cut into travel is because people of the church helped build the building. The whole church. I mean, I can remember showing up here on Fridays and Saturdays, and the amount of people here. I have a 16-year-old brother that him and a bunch of his friends will talk about how they put the sheetrock on that wall.
This church has been built by blood, sweat, and tears of normal people literally getting their hands dirty.
In every aspect, not just the building of the church, whatever it has been.
Whatever it's been.